What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
I have seen gods fly. I've seen men build weapons that I couldn't even imagine. I've seen aliens drop from the sky.
Yeah.
But I have never seen anything like this. How much more are you hiding?
Hold up. Let's go.
We are home. My son, it is your time.
Show me my respect and bow down.
You get to decide what kind of king you are going to be. Don't freeze.
I never freeze.
The revolution will not be televised.
Show me my respect and bow down. We own ya. We own ya. We only getting started now. Cause we own ya. Everybody think they know me now. Cause we own ya. You and I'm a homie. Cause we own ya.
I waited my entire life for this. The world's gonna start over. I'ma burn it all.
What happens now determines what happens to the rest of the world.
You will not be able to stay home, brother. You will not be able to plug in, turn on, and pop out.
What's on that forever?
The revolution will not be televised. Let's have some fun. The revolution will be live.
Marvel's highly anticipated new movie Black Panther certainly has caught our attention here at America Trends and has led to an incredible outpouring of interest all across the nation and around the world. We wanted to know what kind of trend line this might establish for more African and African American films, both those before the camera and behind the camera. So we decided to reach out to a professor of media studies at Quinnipiac University, Dr. Phillip Cunningham. You've got to take a listen to this. Joining us on America Trends is Dr. Phillip Cunningham of Quinnipiac University, and he's here to comment on the phenomenon of Black Panther. And we know it's a movie, but it's becoming a cultural phenomenon. Should we have predicted this?
To some degree, yes. I think the comic book audiences have been longing for, particularly a little bit of difference in terms of who gets to the silver screen. And however, I think to be fair, some of the concerns about how well it would perform, particularly overseas, I think are also very valid.
So can we look at this and say now that there's the myth, and it's been busted, that movies led by minorities aren't financially viable here and overseas?
Well, I want to be very cautious about that, for example, because one of the things we can't fully divorce here is that Black Panther is situated in transmedia storytelling, right? So you have to sort of go see Black Panther if you want to see the continuation of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We know, for example, that because this is a superhero film, this is a genre film, that it was going to be popular regardless of, sort of whether or not American audiences fully received it or audiences abroad fully received it. It was going to make money one way or the other. The only reason I think we should be cautious about ascribing that to black films in general is because to some degree, black films still do not travel abroad, and therein lies the rub. Actually, there's an article in Forbes that I was reading just a couple of days ago in which it looks at several films. I mean, some of them are some rather important and, big films, like even, blockbuster films like Suicide Squad or the Tupac biopic All Eyes on Me, Girls Trip, The Dark Tower, so on and so forth, that just did not even go to places like China. And we can't underestimate, for example, the importance of China in making films blockbusters, or box office successes. So I think we should be very careful in sort of ascribing this to the rest of black films. But I do think that certainly, maybe the chink in the armor is starting to be exposed.
When we look at it, though, I had read where this film has not yet, in its early days, been released in China. Is that true?
Exactly. No, it has not.
So what will happen, do you imagine, in China? Will it still be kind of the Great Wall of China against these kinds of films?
I mean, to be fair, I don't think we should ascribe any more anti-black sentiment to China than we should anywhere else. And again, without a release date there yet, or I should say having not been released there yet, we don't know what it will do. But again, there's some indications that maybe this will be sort of a breakthrough. It's not unlike China, for example. I mean, China hasn't banned much in the way of Marvel movies before, so it's likely that it will be seen there. And so it will be really interesting. Now, I think in terms of other success, I think the other thing to consider is whether or not this is a cultural success. And I think culturally, it's an unprecedented, undoubtable success. It's, again, the finances is where, of course, we need to be concerned, whether or not this franchise will continue.
When I look at some of the recent successes, Get Out did $255 million last year. Girls Trip did rather well. Straight Outta Compton made over $200 million. And the Fast and Furious franchise up to 8 movies deep. And that is quite diverse in its casting. So what is it about films that do well and those that don't if we take, the color of the skin of the stars out of the picture? What are we really looking at here?
So I think in terms of, first, you can think about Fast and Furious, which would probably be next to the Marvel movies, the one sort of diverse film franchise that exists and how well it does overseas. And again, if anything's really odd, the last Fast and Furious film did far better abroad than it did here domestically. I mean, it earned over $1 billion overseas, while domestically, I don't want to say only $200-some-odd million, but really only $200 million. So, having said that, I think some connectivity to a broader universe, is in order. I mean, sequel culture, of course, allows people to engage with material, even if the audience is. I mean, even if the actors change. So we have to remember, for example, the lead actors for the Fast and Furious franchise originally were sort of Paul Walker and Vin Diesel, and then you get others incorporated into it as it goes on, and then by that time, people are fully embedded in an extended universe. Same thing again with Black Panther. People are engrossed in this greater universe. So there's a level of connectivity there that I think actually makes those franchises more successful.
Let me just run down what I've been reading. U.S. audiences, 37% African American, according to exit polling. Gee, we do polling even in theaters. Just slightly ahead of the 35% who were white, and 18% Hispanic. Males were up 55%, and 65% of the audience was under 35. Anything in those numbers that surprises you, Professor Cunningham?
Absolutely not. We've known, for example, that since the 70s, African-American and Latino viewers have propped up the movie industry in many regards. And it's, in fact, if you think about the 1970s, when there was sort of that wave of blaxploitation, one of the reasons it came to an end, of course, is some dissatisfaction with it. But also one of the reasons it came to an end is because studios noticed that black audiences were still going out to mainstream films, right? So you can think about franchises like The Exorcist in the 1970s. Black people went to The Exorcist in droves. And so, people, when the studios started noticing, hey, African Americans will still go to mainstream films, we don't necessarily have to keep packaging these low-budget blaxploitation films to them, and subsequently blaxploitation quickly goes away. And so, again, historically, black viewers and increasingly Latino viewers have always been there. They've just been sort of ignored, especially, I would argue, Latino viewership in the last couple of years.
Let's get back to the cultural aspects of this. Number one, those who are white who are listening to the podcast, can they even begin to understand how important it was for a Black Panther to show a technologically advanced African nation as part of this storyline? To put this in perspective for us.
I don't want to make any assumptions about anyone's ability to understand it, but I think, one of the things that everyone wants to be represented. And I think what sometimes occurs is that people don't see the value of being represented. White viewers in particular don't see the value of being represented primarily because they are so highly represented. They never have to deal with sort of the absence. And I think one of the beautiful things about Black Panther is that it challenges, sort of I think it will challenge white viewers in a way that they haven't been challenged before, in that here's this mainstream action superhero film in which there's minimal white representation. And how they adjust to that will be quite interesting. And again, that makes no assumptions. I don't want to make any assumptions about whether or not white people will engage with something in which, their presence is felt. But some of the consternation that we've seen online, for example, and I don't want to overemphasize, Twitter responses or comment sections or whatever the case may be, but those are, to be fair, the indication there is that some dissatisfaction emerges when white people are not represented in these films. And so, again, representation means a lot. And I think even white viewers can begin to understand that.
As a professor of media studies, as you have looked at films over the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s, how have blacks generally been represented in film?
It's very inconsistent. I think one of the things that we have to keep in mind is who is behind the scenes in terms of in terms of directing and producing these films. And so you could think about how over the last, since the emergence of in the late '80s of filmmakers like Spike Lee, Robert Townsend, and who are able to finally make films on, and start that wave of African American direct filmmakers that we're presently in, with people like Ava DuVernay, Kathy Lemons, and so on and so forth today. So when African Americans are behind the camera, you tend to get a sort of more diverse array of representation. Historically, though, of course, it's always been problematic. And particularly, again, we can look at something like blaxploitation, in which we tend to assume that most of those films were produced by African Americans, and actually the truth is only a handful were. And so I think historically that has always been the case where, there are white people behind the camera or non-black people behind the camera, and we've been subject to their views of what blackness means. And I think, again, the brilliance of a film like Black Panther is that it's taking a conventional genre, a sort of genre that has all these tropes, and subverting it in many ways.
Well, the director, Ryan Coogler, and he, of course, had his debut with Fruitvale Station, and then he had the Rocky spinoff, Creed, and now Black Panther, and they're saying he can write his own ticket. He's the next Spielberg, perhaps. How important will his development and his sensibilities be on our culture going forward?
Undoubtedly, I think it will be important, particularly because one of the things that black films historically have suffered from in some regards is our budgets, right? So we can think about someone who makes tons of movies like Tyler Perry, but gets his films made with minimal budgets. So now we get to see, for example, with a film like Black Panther and a director like Coogler, and again, even someone like Ava DuVernay, who's getting large budgets and being able to make something with Disney. She's doing the remake of A Wrinkle in Time. It says a lot about sort of how far we've come, and again, thinking about how African Americans have always been tied to low budget affairs. It says a lot about where we're going and where we've come from.
In a piece in the Wall Street Journal, Ben Fritz wrote the piece. He said, the success of Black Panther, which had a budget of about $200 million, indicates there isn't just interest in minority representation in big-budget action films, but a pent-up demand. Do you look at that in the same way?
Absolutely. And, I think it's been a concern that's been existed for a long time. And again, we've seen pockets, or some occasions in which you've seen black actors in the lead of these big budget pictures. Again, we think of someone like Will Smith, who for quite some time was sort of Mr. Hollywood and Mr. Box Office, but his draw has begun to wane now. And I think some concerns were going to be, as stars like Will Smith and Denzel Washington's star power have waned, whether or not we were sort of going to be going backwards. And obviously it's clear we're not.
And when we talk about it as a cultural moment, we had fans that were organizing these group outings. We had money being raised for underprivileged children at some of the opening weekend events. I believe we had voter registration going on.
Yeah.
And then we had a lot of activity on social media. People were wearing these colorful dashiki shirts. So put that all in context in terms of the cultural event that this movie represents.
I think one of the things the obvious parallel would be Star Wars. And you think about all the cosplaying around Star Wars and all the energy that goes into seeing that, as someone who's a fan of both Marvel and Star Wars and, exist amongst those audiences, you could tell that there's a very palpable energy amongst Star Wars fans. And again, African American viewers haven't been able to necessarily do that for a property of this nature. Not to suggest that, there's certainly tons of black cosplayers, for example. There's certainly tons of black comic book readers, but there hasn't really been a moment for all those things to coalesce. And I think Black Panther really is the beginning of, seeing this sort of, and I say this lovingly, a black geek culture, right, where there's so many of us who really engage in these sort of fantasy narratives, but we're often ignored. And so, it's just really a cultural phenomenon. It was really hard to go to the film and just not enjoy simply the environment of the film. Those who were in attendance, how they were dressed up, the cheers during specific instances in the film.
Well, put it in perspective. Recently we heard our president calling some African nations an S-hole nation. So put this against that backdrop politically.
Wow, that's a great question. So I think one of the things that the film does in this setting of Wakanda is show a couple of things. One, the sort of potential of, we see utopian or dystopian narratives all the time, but very rarely are they set in Africa. And so the picture of an African utopia, I think, juxtaposed against what Trump is suggesting about Africa is really key. And the movie itself actually draws that out a little bit in, comparing Wakanda, albeit sort of subtly, to places like Nigeria and the like, right? Because there's a scene involving a Boko Haramish type group in it. And so, again, as Americans, our imagination of Africa is very limited. I think this film challenges that, and subsequently also perhaps can challenge our real life notions of African potential.
Now, of course, as a result of this, because it is so hugely successful, that there are others coming forward. There are some who said, well, there was a love scene between two women that was cut out of this, and so there are some in the gay community and lesbian community who are very upset about that. And then there are others, Arabs in our nation and Muslims, who say we have been depicted so horribly in all American films. When's our moment? So what does this lead us to?
Another criticism of the film also is just the depiction of African Americans. So you think about sort of that the villain is African American and not just African, and something else that has drawn a great deal of criticism. And look, these criticisms are valid, and it says a lot about, again, sort of the importance of representation, the importance of being careful when you depict real life scenarios on screen. So I want to be sensitive to those things. On the other hand, I would suggest that, and I don't want to go with the, oh, well, it's just a movie, excuse. But I do think that it says perhaps we're expecting a bit too much from the film in some regards, right, to get every form of representation correct, when at the end of the day, it's still a superhero film, albeit one that subverts tropes, negotiates with norms of the genre, one that does have some powerful messages in it, and does some really unique and great things. It is, at the end of the day, still a superhero film, and so our expectations should be tempered a bit by that.
Well, can we look at the history and go back to Marvel delivering Blade, which featured Wesley Snipes? Is there any comparison to the reaction that we had to that to what's going on today?
You better wake up. The world you live in is just a sugar-coated topping. There is another world beneath it. The real world.
For thousands of years, they have existed among us.
You keep your eyes open. They're everywhere. Chances are you've seen them yourself and didn't know it.
A secret nation.
Our livelihood depends on our ability to blend in.
With a lust for power.
We should be ruling the humans. These people are our food.
They've got their claws into everything. Politics, finance, real estate.
There's a war going on out there. He makes the weapons. I use them.
Now, one will lead them to conquer mankind.
Tonight, the age of man comes to an end.
We're gonna be gods.
And one will try to stop him dead.
There are worse things out tonight than vampires.
Like what?
Like me.
Half human.
Blade's mother was attacked by a vampire while she was pregnant.
Half immortal.
You got the best of both worlds. All our strengths, none of our weaknesses.
He is their greatest fear and our only hope.
It's open season on all vampires.
Wesley Snipes, Stephen Dorff.
You're one of them, aren't you?
No, I'm something else.
Blade.
So I think one of the things Blade does, and I think it's been underestimated, is Blade sort of functions as a bit of a salvation for superhero films. And I actually have said this before, if we think about what happened before Blade, 1997, we have Batman and Robin. And Batman and Robin is sort of seen as, okay, this is the nadir of the superhero genre, just as it's going up. This is ridiculous, it's over the top, and it looks bad. Blade comes out with very low expectations, fairly low, publicity, and I don't want to say it's a revelation, but it does show that, the genre can be done well. And so, it sets forth in, another sort of wave, ushers in another wave of superhero films that really take off. I would argue that Black Panther could do the same. And that, I don't want to overstate the case about how much superhero films are on the wane now, because that would be sort of, a bit blasphemous, especially, with the success of recent films like Thor Ragnarok. But there is a sameness amongst the Marvel universe characters, right? And then, of course, on their counterparts, DC, those films have really done poorly, particularly Justice League, which didn't do very well at the box office, and is really sort of DC as a whole struggling for an identity. So I think Black Panther can be very much what Blade was, a sort of new wave of superhero films.
The fact that Marvel now is part of the Walt Disney Company and family, and of course Walt Disney thought of, I don't know how we can think of it culturally, but perhaps not as one that would be embracing African-American films. So what does this do to extend the possibilities, given that it's now under the banner of the Walt Disney Company?
Disney gave us The Princess and the Frog a couple years ago. one of an African American princess for the first time. And so I think one of the ways we can think of Black Panther is very much in that vein, right? It's a franchise that Disney is known for, and was willing to take a chance with an African American, or in this case, African protagonist. I don't want to ascribe altruistic behavior to Disney. It's a business, and I've said this to others that if Disney could sell you a can of blackness, all rights reserved, trademark, then it would. And in this case, it's just simply taking every movie is a gamble, and Marvel via Disney is simply taking another gamble with another character. And in many regards, Black Panther is no more gamble than, say, Guardians of the Galaxy, a property that nobody heard of. Very few, I should say, outside of the most embedded comic book readers, right, had known of Guardians of the Galaxy. They took a chance with it, and it was wildly successful. I think you could think of Black Panther in that vein as well. So one, simply Marvel/Disney franchising a film in the vein of other things and putting sort of a black face on it, and two, Marvel/Disney taking a risk, because again, every film you put out there is a risk.
I'm reading where the soundtrack album is also logging records, and it's very interesting because I know African Americans have had a very difficult time breaking into movies in the hero mode and often portrayed as the villain and the like. And yet, when it comes to music, it seems as if the entire music industry now is focused, when we watch the Grammys, on the African American artists. Can you juxtapose what's going on in music as opposed to movies?
We've watched over the last couple of years as hip-hop has become what rock was, from the 1960s on. And so as the primary practitioners of hip-hop, as the people we tend to ascribe a great more authenticity to in terms of hip-hop, which is, sort of built on the notion of authenticity and realness, it's subsequently no surprise that African Americans are thriving in that vein, particularly as it becomes a worldwide success. We've never really had too much of a problem, I would say, in the wake of rock, of the 60s and 70s, with African American success in music, although, of course, there was always some pushback on hip-hop. But now that those barriers have been broken down, we're quite okay with African Americans in two roles historically, musicians and athletes. It's when you go outside of those things, when you have to sort of think about African Americans as people, right? You think about dramatic narratives, which audiences turn away from. Therein lies sort of the bigger problem.
And when we look at those white consumers of music today, have they embraced the hip-hop music, or have they just moved elsewhere to perhaps country music, which ultimately morphs into where society leaves a vacuum, they pick it up? Where are the white consumers? Are they still listening to this form of R&B or hip-hop?
Anecdotally, I'll speak about my students here at Quinnipiac, at an institution that has a very large white population. They love hip-hop. They know more about hip-hop than I do in many regards. And so I'll say that, I don't think that they share those concerns in many regards. There are white students here who love Kendrick Lamar, who has these sort of pro-black messages in his music. They love him here. So I don't think that this demographic, this young white people, have as much of a problem with it as people would think. Also, though, I think one of the things that's really interesting here, though, is as you sort of suggest, when you find those people who don't like hip hop, they do tend to retreat to country as sort of the authentic music, as sort of the last bastion of Americana, and it's a really interesting dynamic that occurs.
Well, in closing, I can't let you leave because you comment on what's going on in media today without asking you to express yourself on the Quincy Jones flap that we've heard about the Beatles and Michael Jackson. You have anything you want to offer us on that?
I absolutely loved that interview for just how messy it was. And, you have to be impressed by a couple things. One, you have to be impressed by Quincy Jones's memory. Because either he has a mind like a steel trap, or he has one hell of an imagination, when you consider all those things that he said. But I think it's really a fascinating read for, sort of musicology and the history of music, to see someone who has been at the crux of some huge moments, right? He was there for Beatlemania. He was there with when jazz was still sort of this really popular form in America. He was there at the birth, at the rise of Michael Jackson as a cultural phenomenon, and he has this really jaded view of it all in many respects. So I was floored by it, but I was also, I'll admit, to being greatly amused by it.
Well, I've got to take some exception with what he said about the Beatles, but nonetheless, great to have you with us, Dr. Phillip Cunningham from Quinnipiac University, and I thank you so much for commenting on the phenomenon of Black Panther and entering into these other discussion points about culture here in America. Thank you again.
All right, thank you for having me.